Welcome to Daxue Talks, a show powered by Daxue Consulting, a China-based strategic market research company founded in 2010.
Hi, everyone. My name is Steve Hopkins. I've been operating within the Chinese fintech industry for the past several years, working at Chinese hedge funds, robo-advisors, cryptocurrency investment banks, and wealth tech startups across mainland and Hong Kong. I've been studying Chinese language and culture for the past 10 plus years, and I'm the co-founder of the China Guys. TCG is a firm full of professional China watchers that track regulatory, economic, and policy updates within China's business landscape and present them in digestible, bite-sized pieces through newsletters and research articles. For clients with more specialized needs, we also provide tailored consultative services within the Chinese market. We're newly started, but I would love if anyone listening to this would check us out at thechinaguys.com. I'm excited to be presenting this talk for Daxue Consulting, and let's get started.
What problems do fintech solutions attempt to solve in modern banking?
So I think before you ask about what problems fintech solutions are trying to alleviate in modern society, you kind of need to get a base of reference. So fintech as a class sort of has its roots in the early 1900s, where what people think is the very first instance of fintech technology, not as we know it, but as the world saw it, was as a transfer of orders for the purchase of stock over telegraph. And that happened in early 1900s. I think it was something like 1906, 1908. And so you can kind of think about the 1900s early on through maybe the 1970s, 1980s as that first stage of fintech, where you were more just trying to develop the concept of how to use technology to further everyday business operations. Phase two was probably from the 1970s, 1980s to the mid-2000s. And so in 1972, you had the NASDAQ, who was pretty innovative and bringing electronic quotations over to these brokerages, the investment banks, etc. You had E-Trade come on as the first online brokerage. And so I think you can probably classify this stage two as sort of the internetization of fintech. And then phase three, which is the mid-2000s through current, is really what we consider fintech, the digitalization of these products, of these services, which is really just focusing on getting more widespread adoption through working out the kinks in the system. And so this has been characterized by robo-advisors, mobile payments, digital banks, that sort of thing. Things that are, kind of the common industry buzzwords now for everyone who's following the fintech industry. So, just like that, I think that fintech as an industry, people try to oversimplify it by saying fintech does this, fintech does that. And, the reality is that fintech does have, at face value, some simple use cases. So yes, Robinhood, a classic example in the States. They're beginning to offer some digital banking services. They got their name as an online brokerage that focused on or targeted millennial clients. But those sorts of concepts that we're very familiar with. There's also use cases of fintech solutions that are pretty convoluted that we'll talk about a little bit more in this discussion. And so, a classic example over in China is supply chain finance, where you can use basically a blockchain-based platform to work out some of the kinks in supply chain finance and, in a very much simplified term, allow SMEs that are deep within big corporation supply chains get access to much needed funding and capital liquidity. And so, this is all to say that fintech is just a very broad phrase for saying it's finance plus technology, using technology to work out some of the kinks within the financial system as we know it.
What is special about China's fintech market?
So I think that China is very unique in the broader sense that the Chinese market is pretty isolated. There's a lot of cultural language barriers. That means that it's just a little bit more complex to break into for foreign entrants. And because of that, there's a few more complexities that you need to think about when you're trying to operate within China, whether you're a natural Chinese firm or a foreign player trying to operate within Chinese market. But within that, there's also, along with these complexities, there's a lot of benefits within the operations of the Chinese market. So if you're already within the market, you have fewer barriers of entry into the financial industry as opposed to a few comparable Western counterparts. There's a lot of central support through regulation, through easy access to capital and liquidity, as long as your fintech solution is aligned with the central government's key areas of focus and the country's overall development priorities. And I think probably the last most notable one is that the Chinese domestic market is huge. Just think about the population of China, 1.5 billion people. And yeah, you can kind of segment that out to say, well, the vast majority of these, of the firm fintech players aren't going to be trying to access this entire market as a whole. But think about this. As of 2018, over 800 million Chinese consumers had internet access, and 98 of that was through mobile devices, which means this is a massive market of potential users that really bring an opportunity for firms that find the right channels to get their message out, have a product that can actually provide some value to people's lives. It brings them a huge opportunity for explosive growth, the type of stuff that, the unicorn stories that you hear about are made of.
What have the US and other countries learned from China's fintech scene?
It's a good question. There's definitely an attitude of healthy competition between what I would call Eastern and Western fintech circles. But at the end of the day, I think that fintech, the whole purpose of fintech is that it's a little bit broader than arbitrary borders. And so everyone across the globe, whether you're in the West or the East, is constantly studying each other, learning what they can from use cases and other companies' successes and failures. So, on a broader level, I think more interesting question is probably, what is sort of the one or two main takeaways that have really unified players within the fintech market. And so remember that players are not necessarily only startups or companies that are providing these fintech solutions, but also educational facilities, governments, etc. I think probably one lesson really rings louder than most. On a very broad level, I think a lot of countries across the globe are beginning to recognize that, while regulation is certainly needed for consumer protections, particularly within the financial industry, it can directly impede innovation. And so, kind of the solution that regulators have come to try to walk that line is to establish regulatory sandboxes, which are just basically frameworks that are meant to spur innovation by lowering regulatory hurdles for innovators. And so what this really means is that, these specific areas, the regulators within these specific areas will allow these companies to come register with them, gain access to a controlled environment where they can get relaxed exposure to legal limitations and restrictions. They can test their products and their services with a confined user base. And, they can basically have an easier operating environment for a set amount of time. And so This kind of advancement of regulatory sandboxes are pretty important development for not only the global fintech scene, but I would say probably the broader technology industry, in that it just gives a little bit more breathing room to these firms that are already playing against the odds. Just gives them a little bit more freedom in operations and a little bit more autonomy to really try to bring innovation to the industry.
Where are China's fintech hubs?
Yeah, so China, every city really has its own pocket of fintech players, of a fintech culture. But I think if you're just talking broadly, there's a few main ones. Beijing, which has Zhongguancun and Chaoyang. Hangzhou, which has the big players, obviously. Shenzhen, Chengdu, which is an emerging startup haven for fintech players. And China, or at least the central government, is putting a lot of time, effort, and resources into developing what they hope is going to become the next central fintech hub, which is Xiong'an. This is a city that's a little bit south of Beijing. And so all of these cities obviously have slightly different undertones. For example, Zhongguancun, because of its proximity to government within Beijing, is going to have be better for some of the fintech firms that are dealing with a little bit more sensitive sorts of products that need those sorts of bureaucratic relationships, etc. And Shenzhen obviously is right across the harbor from Hong Kong, and so they have a little bit more international of a perspective of market opportunities, however you want to call it. But ultimately, all of these places are really pretty well blossoming with fintech innovation.
Any questions? We will find an expert to answer them. Drop your questions in the comments or send us an email, dx@daxueconsulting.com.